Hello, everyone. My name's Matt. I will be your master of ceremonies for the rest of today. And after those passionate starting words from Tony, let's get straight into our first session of this amazing conference. We're going to zoom out a bit here, not to go high level for high level's sake, but to look at the big picture, where open source security is heading and what that means for the people like you doing the work every day. Because let's face it, security has changed, the perimeter's gone, the stack is abstracted, and we're depending more than ever on open source components, tooling, and infrastructure. So, to help us unpack that, we're joined by someone that's been at the heart of this transformation, Gab Columbro. Gab is one of the leading voices on how we build trust, resilience, and shared responsibility across open source cloud ecosystems. He's not just a policy person, he's a builder. He works with foundations, governments, and some of the biggest engineering teams in the world to move the conversation forward. Please give a big virtual conference welcome to Gab. Gab, my apologies if I've mispronounced that at the start, teething problems, but yes, please take it away. I cannot wait to hear this session.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for having me here. A virtual hello to everyone on the line. I'm very excited to and honored, honestly, to have the opportunity to open this first Open Cloud Security Conference. When full disclosure, Tony is a really good friend. When Tony asked me to, we go way back, and when he asked me to come and join, I said, obviously I'm not a security expert by any means, but I have been around the block a couple of times when it comes to open source. And so this is a topic that is very much near and dear to my heart. And something what I hope, again, as the person who introduced me said, hopefully, I can share with you what I've seen throughout the 20 years of my career. Yes, I'm aging myself in open source, and effectively, not only why open cloud security is a good idea, but why I would argue is inevitable. Just sort of to set the stage, I'll start with a little bit of a personal story. And yes, that is me. About 20 years ago, at the time, I did my first open source contribution. Maybe I wasn't doing necessarily the contribution right there and then, but little did I know that, 20 years later, that would have drove me to become first, the leader of the FinTech Open Source Foundation, FINOS, and then more recently, the general manager of Linux Foundation Europe. For those of you who are not familiar with the Linux Foundation, which I hope you are, it's not just hosting the Linux kernel, but it's truly bringing together individuals, corporates, and increasingly the public sector across some of the most critical pieces of open source in the world. And what I've learned, while I obviously started with a individual motivator to contribute to open source, when I got that Apache address, I was the happiest kid in the world. And so it definitely did start with this idea of solving bigger problems that you can individually. That's where the movement started. But what I've learned over the last 20 years, especially in the world of foundations, which are designed to bring together all the different constituencies that contribute and adopt open source, it's really been that it's about business outcomes. From a corporate standpoint, they don't invest in open source because of charity. They do invest in open source because they want ROI. And so it all comes down to the concept of trust. Ultimately, what foundations are there for is to build trust amongst small and large contributors, individuals, public sector, that open source will stay there forever. And that each one sort of has a level playing field when it comes to contributing to open source. What does that result in? I mean, simply put, there will be no cloud without open source. Over 90% of cloud workloads run on Linux, and if you go up the stack, over 84% of organizations are either using or evaluating Kubernetes. These are massive ecosystems that are both hosted under the Linux Foundation and have created not only sort of massive adoption, but massive market capitalization around the commercial startups that have been built around both, again, Linux, one of the biggest acquisitions out there, the IBM Red Hat acquisition, and Kubernetes. But I find that if you zoom out, again, in cloud, but beyond that, there was a very interesting study published by Harvard earlier in the year. I very much recommend you to take a look, which is probably one of the most impressive numbers out there. It's estimated that corporations have put over $4 billion into open source, whether it's corporations, VCs, or sweat equity. And they have extracted about 8.8 trillion of value. This is a 1000x multiplier, which really comes to show that, again, this is not just about individual motivators, but that trust truly enables sort of massive outcomes. And it's not just sort of on the technology side, on the pure technical side. As I said, open source is way more than code. I am sort of a personal witness of one of the most conservative and competitive industries in the world, truly having come together on open source. Look, it hasn't been always the case that financial services was bullish on open source. They've always used open source, maybe in denial, maybe admitting it or not. But surely when we started Finos in 2016, the usual myths about open source security were still there. Isn't open source insecure? Why would I risk giving out my customer data and open myself up to regulatory fines? The truth is that in the short span of a few years, these organizations, again, some of the most regulated, competitive, and conservative from a cultural and sort of risk aversity standpoint, they quickly overcome those myths. And now they've become one of the most active industries, probably second only to big tech, in terms of their engagement in open source. They've contributed massive projects that drove us as Finos to join the Linux Foundation. They're starting to adopt and build industry consensus in the open when it comes to tech risk, when it comes to cloud controls, when it comes to AI governance. We'll touch a little bit on that later. But the point here is open source has truly eaten not only software, but is increasingly eating every industry out there. So open source run cloud. Open source security, I argue, has won. By the way, this is my best attempt to generate a visual representation of Linus's law, which you might be familiar with through AI. Linus famously said, given enough eyes, all bugs are shallow. There you go. That's your visual representation there. But the truth is that, again, while I started 10 years ago in financial services, those myths were still there. Effectively, the general consensus is that open source provide superior security posture, whether it comes to the transparency. I mean, trust but verify, it's a big tenet of the security community. And obviously, open source provide that level of inspection and inspectability of everything that you're running in production. Obviously, the collective expertise, we've been running now for a couple of years, tabletop exercises at our conferences. Again, bringing together under Chatham House rules or full in the open, some of the greatest sort of CISOs across the industry, as they all enjoy sharing and building on each other's understanding of how to deal with, a threat that could potentially take down one of the most critical industries in the world. And I'm talking to financial services here. Last but not least, you know, uh, I think everyone should be familiar with the Log4Shell vulnerability that happened a few years ago, and in a way sort of rocked the open source world. It's interesting to see how Log4Shell was actually patched in, less than a couple of days since making its course through the security to the responsible disclosure process. So, it has been proven over and over again that open source communities, especially well funded and well maintained, provide a much faster response time when it comes to security issues versus having to trust sort of a single entity. Obviously, I'm in the bubble, but this is something that out there has been increasingly one of those myths, open source is insecure, that has been more and more dispelled. So open source security has won, but I want to introduce, and that's sort of the trend that we've been seeing across not only the Linux Foundation and our sub-foundations, but truly across the broader ecosystem, is the idea of open source collaboration for security in support of secure practices and secure posture. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Open Source Security Foundation, but it's one of the largest foundations under the Linux Foundation. It was launched on 2020, took over the infrastructure that was previously known as that was previously built in response to the Heartbleed bug. And it really started with the idea of building a fund and tooling to measure and address the security posture of open source projects. It launched in 2020 with major industry support, really with an initial focus on open source supply chain security. And guess what? We looked very, very intelligent when a couple of months later, Log4Shell came up. And whilst Log4Shell is not a project of the Linux Foundation, it actually sits under Apache, we did actively work with our communities to make sure that, not only we supported upstream projects like contributing to Apache, contributing to Eclipse, both in terms of monetary and sort of sweat equity, but we also work downstream with our users to be able to adopt those changes. Quickly, in response to Log4Shell, a major fund was launched called Alpha Omega. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but simply put, there's been over $20 million put into this fund over the years, where Alpha is really about fixing the sort of key top dependencies that the world depends on and increasing their security posture. And Omega is truly about funding the long tail of list maintained project, but still very critical. Think about all those libraries on NPM. Think about those sort of random maintainers in Nebraska, if you're familiar with the XKCD comic. And since then, we've seen more and more support for community-led activities. SigStore is now a majorly used project to basically manage end-to-end attestation of the artifacts that you produce out of your CI/CD pipeline, and it's now used in over 60,000 repos out there. And we're just getting started. We now are in the wake of the XUtils backdoor. We're looking at building trust, which is a slightly different concept than security, but really how do we identify or at least have a reputation mechanism for maintainers before they get accepted and potentially, introduce vulnerabilities like in the XZ case. Just 2 days ago, LLM verification and attestations tools have been put forward by the OpenSSF. So I don't want this to be sort of an OpenSSF commercial per se, but the point that I'm trying to make here is that there's a lot of collaboration ongoing out there in the open to address security issues. And this is something that I think it's a macro trend that everyone should be keeping an eye on. I will push it even further with a industry-specific example. On the FINO side, a couple of years ago, one of the large financial institutions came to us with a problem statement, which was we're global organizations. We have to comply with multiple security and tech risk regulations. They oftentimes are fragmented, not aligned with each other, and additionally, regulators are growing quite worried about the risks of cloud concentration, the systemic risk of us as a financial institution depending on a single cloud vendor. And so we took it up on ourselves to bring together a community of both financial institutions and technology service providers, cloud service providers. This is truly a shared responsibility model. We'll touch on it a little bit later on, whereby we started building an industry consensus on what it means to secure common cloud services. If you are a financial institution, what are the threats? What are the mitigations? Let's build tests and infrastructure as code in the open. And the beauty of open source here is not only that we were able to bring the industry and sort of the two major constituencies, financial institutions and CSPs, together to have a say on how the project and the standard will be defined, but also that we can reuse upstream existing open source components or standards like OSCAL or NIST specifications. And the ultimately hope is that regulators will start mapping against this standard rather than coming up with fragmented regulations. And so again, not only open source security one, but open source for addressing a security concern continues to be a major trend out there. I want to quickly reiterate the fact that, especially when it comes to cloud security, shared responsibility is the keyword. Ultimately, it is especially in regulated industries, it's the end user who's responsible to comply with regulations, but it cannot do that without an active participation of the cloud service provider, infrastructure provider, and third-party software providers that they depend on. So in fact, it's a bit of a symbiotic relationship because on the other hand, CSPs don't have any idea of your internal sort of risk policies as well as risk appetite if you're talking, particularly about non-regulated industries. So I just wanted to call out how open source becomes a very powerful way to bring these constituencies early in the cycle together to define, the common standard and patterns and controls that they both will have to contribute abiding to. And call me biased, but when I took over the Linux Foundation Europe job, it became pretty clear that a lot of my experience in financial services would be quite relevant as software is becoming increasingly regulated in Europe, but not only. And this means that, once again, it's not just a shared responsibility, but it's a mandated, a sort of nation state mandated requirement for not only shared responsibility, but actually open collaboration. I mean, if you're familiar with DORA from the EU, It explicitly warns against cloud concentration and the idea of requiring actual resilience versus sort of third-party software providers, to have a plan B, to avoid vendor lock-in. If you think about the Cyber Resilience Act, since we took the since I took the job 2 years ago, I thought I was going to do some software, but primarily I ended up working in policy in Brussels, as the Cyber Resilience Act has really raised the bar, not just for software, commercial software being put on the EU market, but truly for every open source projects upstream. In fact, foundations are now officially recognizing the law as stewards. It's not just the EU. We all have to comply with these regulations as open source contributors. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago at this point, the Linux Foundation had to take a drastic measure to remove some of the kernel developers from accessing the kernel code in order to comply with OFAC sanction US regulations. So I think this is when you look at sort of the shared responsibility model, this is yet another strong motivator to, in a way, shift left the collaboration between different counterparties. And yes, we can keep doing it on a point-by-point basis with contracts and NDAs, but when you start looking at the scale of the problem, where you have multi-parties participating in the shared responsibility model, when you have, again, entire industries that need to comply with the specific standard, then it's easy to see how, especially when it comes to defining open source security standards, sort of security standard and cloud security standards, open source is a very viable option. I will, as I start wrapping, there is one more aspect that I want to point you to. When I started in Finos, and we are a global organization, it became pretty clear to me that as financial institutions are global organizations, and they are highly interconnected with each other, they have to transact with each other, they have to interact with each other to just do business. And it became very clear that, you know, we are only as secure as our weakest link. If you look at our members, they are the largest tier one financial institutions, and they have no problem investing in lifting the whole industry, especially when it comes to protecting and managing risk and protecting from cyber attacks. Ultimately, again, we're only as secure as our weakest link. And so as cloud is global, security, I see a very strong parallel here with security being global. And if you look at the current geopolitical situation, open source has pretty much remained one of the sort of last bastions of global collaboration, where we can collaborate across regions, across borders, across companies. We touched on the concentration risk. It's not just about vendor lock-in. Regulators are mandating preventing dependency on a single vendor at the systemic level. Tech sovereignty is on the rise. And if you pair that with the southern cross-border relationship, it seems very wise to not put all your chips in the basket of a single vendor, or at least make sure that you have a plan B. And generally, a commercial vendor backed by an open source core gives you that degree of flexibility to, again, you never know if you're going to be able to access a certain vendor, or be able to trust a certain vendor coming from a specific region in the next few years. And this is why I think, before I wrap, there's one final point that I don't want to make this all about corporates. I don't want to make this all about geopolitics. Ultimately, as I said at the beginning, it all starts from individual motivators. And I used to be a Maven guy before they wouldn't let me touch code anymore. So I sort of grew up in the DevOps, maybe pre-DevOps revolution. But this is a generation that has grown in open source. Most of the CI/CD pipeline that we all sort of grew up with is open source, and so there is a talent aspect here in buying into this open source value proposition. And what I've seen in my world in finance is that that's also a really good idea to get your next job. GitHub is the new LinkedIn, and open source, it's your sort of personal go-to-market when it comes to be able to sort of get directly in front, showcase your abilities directly in front of some of the largest institutions in the world. And so I want to wrap sort of by bringing it all together. When you look at the level of penetration that open source has gotten to, when you look at the inherent shared responsibility model that exists in cloud, when you look at the geopolitical risks that increasingly enterprises and individuals have to face in the current climate, and when you look at the mind share and the buy-in of an existing engaged community like DevOps and DevSecOps, there's huge alignment in terms of principles. Open cloud security doesn't seem to me just a good idea. Seems truly inevitable. It seems like it will be, the next big area of evolution, especially in the cloud side of the house. And that is why I was very excited to be part of this. And when Tony asked me to join today, I want to close by saying the beauty of open source is that every one of you can contribute, and that every constituency, as we discussed, has an advantage. It's a positive sum game. And I hope this presentation has, and most importantly, the rest of the agenda is going to inspire you to participate and join the movement. So thank you so much. And I'm wondering if there are questions, or I